All right, good day, everyone. So in this lecture, we'll be talking about how the Philippines computes the macro statistics that we've talked about from ManQ. Before that, we'll try to set the stage a little bit for the course and macroeconomics in general. So this is probably your first macro economics course, and there's a lot of interesting topics that can be studied in this course, and this course is meant to sort of introduce you to a lot of those things. So macroeconomics is the study of economies, right? National level economies, typically. It involves the study of macro statistics, GDP, GNP, inflation, unemployment, etc. It affects the lives of everyone in the country and the people of the lives of the people in the country in the future as well. Businesses look to assess the health of the country, whether the country is a good investment opportunity or is politically stable. Usually, national governments are judged based on the performance on these indicators. As such, these statistics are heavily monitored. Macroeconomics has many subfields, growth, for instance. So you can have a study on growth. We will be talking about growth for the last month, maybe 3 weeks. You can think about cross-country comparisons, the measurement of growth itself, growth strategies, the intersection of growth between growth and poverty and inequality, sustainable development. You might encounter a lot of these in specific field courses such as development economics, and other field courses that have a macroeconomic side to them. Right? We'll be talking about inflation, unemployment, what determines these things, some theories surrounding them, balance of payments, the open economy, again, is a very, very important part of the Philippine experience, as well as the Philippine macroeconomy, as well as macroeconomics in general. A lot of this course will deal with short-run income determination models called the ISLM. And then we'll be talking about the role of government policy and trying to ameliorate these um, business cycle issues, right? Business cycle dips in GDP are trying to control too hot of an economy, right? All of these things will become clearer as we get to talking about the theory of short-run income determination or the theory of ISLM. Next is government debt and taxation. So again, government debt and taxation is very important from low and medium income country point of view, especially how to manage your debt and how to have a sustainable level of debt. And yet, debt is very important in the Philippines. We always have to issue debt because our government budget is bigger than what our taxation can handle. Other very important issues that you may be interested in when you're studying macro, right? The experience of the export sector, whether it's manufacturing exports, the ability to do agricultural exports, break into other countries like international trade. Also interesting is, from the Philippines perspective, is the labor export or services exports. So all of these are also very important in the macroeconomy. Banking and finance, real estate, all of these are, in my opinion, somewhat understudied facets of macroeconomics. So you may be interested in thinking about these things from a both theoretical lens as well as an empirical lens. Next is human capital development, how education is important to not just long run growth, but the macroeconomic job market as well. And then finally, in this course, we'll be talking about a model where there's an efficient allocation of resources. Okay. More modern takes on it would have models where there are these inefficient allocation of factors of production. And this can happen through political economy, risk aversion, lack of information, lack of investment, public investment in infrastructure or market power. So all of these factors can create this inefficient allocation of factors of production and can affect not just long-run growth up here, which is very important. It can also affect the short-run determination of income, and it would have like business cycle effects as well. All right, so this is the overview of this course, and I invite you to revisit this list every so often, especially since you're here in UPSE. And if you're interested in macroeconomics as well, these are the things that you can like think about moving forward. Okay, so this class is an introduction to many of these issues. Model building and macro, we talked about this in ManQ already as well. In this course, a lot of what we'll be doing is thinking about theories in macroeconomics. And whenever we do that, we'll make sure to examine what are the endogenous variables and what are the exogenous variables in our models. So something that you may be interested in, especially since you might have learned this from microeconomics, is in micro, there's a lot of optimization by firms and consumers. Consumers maximize utility and firms optimize profits. So these assumptions are in the background of our models. So even though you don't see the word Umax or profit max, these are always there whenever you think about all of the models that we're thinking about or discussing here in this course. All right, so now let's go to GDP, our first macro statistic. The Philippines has a very similar approach to GDP, except for some very important differences. Okay, so first, let's again revisit the concept. There are two ways to view it, either total income or total expenditure, right? And I invite you to think again about the circular flow diagram, right? Where money is flowing in one direction and it's also flowing in the other direction. So that's why it's a circular flow. And the reason why it's captured in GDP is because of the flow of money, right? The flow of expenditure and the flow of income. If it's just the flow of goods that's moving, then it's not going to be captured by GDP. Okay, so GDP is a flow. We're reminded that GDP is a flow. It tells us the amount of pesos circulating in the economy in a given amount of time, the expenditure flow on pesos of products and services produced in the country in a given period of time are equal to the income received by these factors of production. So GDP is in terms of market value, in terms of pesos, and this is how you're able to aggregate the value of production because it's in the same units, pesos. And you can imagine listing the total expenditure and final goods as the following: P1X1, P2X2, until PNXN. And if you sum all of that, that will give you GDP. And then there's a discussion here about used goods, okay, inventories. I invite you to go back and revisit the earlier, the book, as well as a discussion on these. Hence, in concept, GDP is basically the sum of the market value of final goods in the economy in terms of value added, summation of value added within a particular point in time. Okay. The value added part is actually very important as we'll go forward, so I should revisit that here. So products are usually produced as part of a value chain. GDP only includes final goods. Intermediate goods are part of the cost of final goods and already included in the production value of the final good. We can add up the value added. And again, value added is the price of the sales, the value of the sales minus the value of the purchased intermediate goods used to produce those sales at each stage of production. And that's one of the methods we use to calculate GDP, including the Philippines. And here you have the expenditure approach where GDP is divided into consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So consumption consists of goods and services bought by households. Three categories: non-durable goods, durable goods, and services. Investment consists of goods bought for future use. Investment is divided into three subcategories: business fixed, residential fixed, and inventory investment. Government purchases are goods and services bought by federal, state, and local governments. Net exports are the value of goods and services sold to other countries minus the value of goods and services that foreigners sell to us. So now we turn to actual GDP estimation. It's very similar to the value-added approach, as you will see, except if you recall in ManQ, they explicitly talked about the underground economy. So in the Philippines, we need to incorporate the underground economy because of its size, and it's very important. So I will show you um, a document that basically talks about how um, I have shared with you a report, I should say, by Bersales that talks about the size of the underground economy or the informal economy in the Philippines. I included some snippets in this document as well, but I also uploaded the original document. All right, so that's one of the main differences between our approach and the approach that Mankey describes. However, we will use the production approach still, which is just the sum of the value added at each stage of production for each industry. And here's the methodology. Here's some statistics. Not statistics, the methodology. You can get that from the PSA directly. And here I just copied it. So methodologies, GDP is the sum of gross value added of all resident producer units. So remember, resident, it's because you need to be in the country. That's why it's called domestic. All of the domestic producers' output or production is included within a period of time. Now, gross value added is defined as the value of output less the value of intermediate consumption. Output is defined as the goods and services produced by an establishment. It's equal to the value of sales adjusted for the changes in inventories of finished goods, that is, goods produced and ready for sale, but not yet sold, or goods sold adjusted for sales of goods produced in an earlier period. Meanwhile, intermediate consumption consists of the value of the goods and services consumed as inputs by a process of production, excluding fixed assets, whose consumption is recorded as consumption of fixed capital. So again, this is very similar to what we've talked about. It's value added, output minus intermediate consumption. So GDP is based on this concept of gross value added. And here are some ways for them to track using surveys what the gross output is. And this is what they subtract from it. And this is what is considered as intermediate consumption. So it doesn't say, but there are derived from specific items and processed from the results of establishment surveys, household surveys, and administrative data, right? So all of these things are coming from government-funded data on establishment surveys, household surveys, and administrative data, where they get values of the gross output and the values of intermediate consumption for the different PSNA groups, 16 industries from the PSNA groups. Okay. There's a specific listing of different kinds of manufacturing, different kinds of wholesale, different kinds of services, financial services, and so on. So you have a list of 16 major industries that are in the Philippines. And what this is saying is that GDP is essentially the sum of the gross value added of all of these ones, right? So simple enough. Now, how would you do GVA at the industry level, one of those 16? So the important difference between the United States and the Philippines is in the Philippines, we have the organized and the unorganized industry. So this is the first important concept that you should keep in mind. The organized industry includes establishments and the government as producers of market output, output for own use, non-market outputs. While unorganized includes those that are not part of the organized industry, but also producers of output such as households. So here's your organized industry, which is your typical GVA or gross value added or producers production, production estimation approach. So GVA and A is basically the product of GVA of the organized multiplied by the GVA of the unorganized. So you can think of the unorganized as the sort of shadow or informal sector of the economy. So how do you deal with this GVA organized? For the organized industry, it's simple. For each J of the 16, you add up the GVAs for the different sub-industries, which are the 5-digit PSIC in the JF industry. And then each GVA is simply gross output minus intermediate consumption, which is, again, the concept we've been talking about with regard to production estimation approach. So that's the organized industry. What about the unorganized industry? So the unorganized industry, the goods and services produced not captured in formal surveys like ASPBI or CPBI, as well as administrative data, are included by indirect estimation using the residual employment approach. So what is that? So using this approach, what happens is there's an employment in unorganized industry, which is the residual or the difference between the employment from the labor force survey per industry and the CPBI for the benchmark year or the ASPBI for non-benchmark years. The residual employment is multiplied by the output of small establishments with those less than 20 in ASPBI and CPBI, 20 employees, to derive the gross output of the unorganized industry. So what this is saying is that once you have the labor, okay, that for unorganized industry per 5-digit, right? What will happen per industry, I should say. What will happen? This is the employment of unorganized, which is the difference between the employment as measured by the LFS and the employment measured by the ASPBI or the CPBI, and the difference will be the employment. This same employment will be brought down here to equation 2. And that equation, employment from the unorganized will be multiplied to the gross output per capita of these small establishments. Right? So you have to calculate, the statisticians, calculate the output, gross output of small establishments. The gross output per capita of small, it should really be per labor. So gross output per worker of small establishments or these establishments with less than 20 employees. So this statistic, this labor productivity is calculated from your ASPBI, your establishment surveys, which are part of those administrative surveys that the government undertakes. And then you use that value here. And what you're saying is that the unorganized output is essentially has the same technology or the same productivity as the organized businesses, but they're small, right? So there's no difference between the unorganized business and the organized small businesses. And by small, we mean establishments with less than 20 employees. So for these establishments, they're looking at, okay, how much output are they using or producing per unit of labor per worker. And that's how you use that information, this one, to calculate GO. So you use this one, which is the output per worker for the small enterprises. That's coming from, and this figure is coming from these enterprise surveys. And then you're multiplying it by the estimated employment in the unorganized industry. Okay. So if you think about the units, this is going to be output per worker. Then you multiply it by the number of workers. Then you get the output for the unorganized. Right? And then finally, from GO unorganized, how do you get GVA unorganized? You get GO unorganized times GVA for R small. Okay. So what's that? Gross value added is derived by multiplying the resulting gross output to the gross value added ratio of small establishments. Okay, that's the ratio this is the gross value added ratio of small establishments. Then you're multiplying it by the gross output of the unorganized. Okay. So what that will give you is the gross value added for the entire unorganized part of that particular industry. All right. So these two are ratios here. GO per capita is a ratio. Is that here? GO. No, but this is a ratio because it's from here. It's the per capita output. And GVA R small is also a ratio. It's the gross value added ratio for small establishments. So this just means that it's the what this looks like is for all the small establishments which we've defined as 20, you're going to look at how much is the gross value added of them of these establishments, and then per unit of output. Okay. So that's why it's a ratio where the denominator here is output, and that's why the output is cancels out. So gross output is in the numerator, and then gross output here. There's a denominator here with gross output, and that goes away. And what remains is basically the estimated GVA for the entire industry, for the unorganized sector of the industry. So unlike in estimating GVA of the organized industry, estimating GVA of unorganized is done at a more aggregate level. So recall that here in the organized, you are going to do the GVA per 5-digit. But what they're saying here is it's done at the more aggregate level, at the 16-digit level. Not 16-digit, but at the 16 PSNA industries, which are here. Right? So instead of at the different 5-digit, which are these ones here. That's why there's summed to M. So that's essentially they're only done 16 times. This estimation here, this imputation here, is done 16 times for the 16 major aggregate industry categories in the Philippines. And it's done because of limitations in terms of representativeness of the data. Right. Oh, so this just continues to explain what the gross value added ratio is. So notice that gross value added ratio is gross value added divided by gross output, which is why you can look at this and then substitute this one into here, and then you'll realize that you have gross output of the unorganized and gross output down here in the denominator, which is why you will get gross value added for the unorganized by step 3, by multiplying these two quantities. This ratio against multiplied by the total output by the unorganized group. All right, so derivation of GDP at constant prices. So for right now, our constant price estimation is based on 2018 as the base year. So we talked about in Manki, we talked about what the base year is. And the base year is when you fix the prices in order to calculate GDP. And in the Philippines currently, the 2018 happens to be our base year. All right. A simple note, going from production to the expenditure-based estimates. So in this one, we briefly discuss, and this is a fairly complex topic, discuss the commodity approach. So once you're able to calculate at the industry level, so if you notice here, you've got the different industries as rows, you are able to use the commodity approach and what are called supply and use tables or input-output tables from the PSA to then allocate that supply to consumption, to domestic users, and to intermediate consumption. Okay, so that's the key part of this paragraph here, that you're moving from the production approach, which estimates your total GDP or your GDP based on these different industry classifications, the 16 industries. You're able to move that into these different bins, which are familiar: intermediate consumption, government spending, investment, consumption, etc. And how are these done? So generally, it will be done based on industry categories. Typically, there'll be ratios based on past data from regularly conducted consumption and establishment surveys to fill in these cells to know intermediate consumption and the value of household consumption. Final consumption will be a residual. Total supply minus intermediate consumption equals final consumption. Of course, you'll also remove government consumption here as well. So this is how you move from the production side. Once you have outputs per industry, then you will move from here to allocating that to the expenditure components based on this commodity flow technique using supply and use tables or input-output tables. So those are similar top words for the same idea. And that's how you get from GDP to the different expenditure components, C, I, G, and NX. Okay. And you're going to use a lot of different other industry surveys or household surveys or surveys from or data from customs, for example. They would also know how much of our output has been turned into exports, for example, right? And how much imports that we had per industry. All right, so that's the commodity flow method, and that's how they're able to estimate the expenditure side from using the production estimation method, the sum of the GVAs. All right, so let's move on to other topics. We'll revisit the informal sector in a moment. But first, let's review real versus nominal. So nominal GDP uses current period prices to value output. So this is just the sum. So notice the T's are the current T's, and they're both P and Q have the same T's. But real GDP is when you fix prices. So notice that PIB, B is the base, and it's going to be fixed. But the Q's will be different because they're indexed by T, or the current time period, right? Real GDP and time T requires Q from current time period T. But the base year is based on whatever the base year is. In the Philippines, it happens to be 2018 currently. The GDP deflator is simply the ratio between NGDP and RGDP. Specifically, it's NGDP divided by RGDP. GDP versus GNP. GNP is GDP plus factor payments from abroad minus factor payments to abroad. All right, so Philippines, and we'll go back to rebasing. So every so often, there'll be rebasing, right? Changing the base year. So currently, it's 2018. Before, it was I think it was 2010, right? They'll probably um, want to do it every so often. Why? Well, here's the reason. As per PSA Board Resolution 11, series of 2018, the PSA has embarked on a series of activities to revise and rebase to 2018. Right? Why? Because you have the development and utilization of more updated national accounts can provide planners and policymakers and researchers with an effective tool to do economic analysis and policy formulation. Additional and more comprehensive data become available, such as those from the census or input-output table. There is a need to revise PSNA to be in accordance with international guidelines, and regularly updating of the base year is necessary to capture changes in the economy, consumer behavior, changes in user needs, and statistical developments. So it's not clear between how many years they do it. I think it has at least been 10 years prior to 2018. It has at least been 10 years. I think actually it's been quite a while between 2018. If I remember correctly, the last base year was year 2000. Okay, back then, right? And then they changed it to 2018. If it's hopefully they'll be changing again, doing a rebase before 2030 happens. So it's currently 2025 as 2024 as we're doing this course. So hopefully by 2028, they'll be rebasing it again, because you'll need to have an updated base year. Because once the problem with fixing the base year is that you are not able to capture these changes in the economy, consumer behavior, statistical developments, and changes in user needs. You're keeping the base prices constant, even though over time, the structure of the economy is changing and the relative prices of the economy are changing. If you recall, we flashed on the screen, I think it was our first video, there's going to be a difference between real GDP and real GNP as you move away from the base year. And some of that difference will be based on the fact that, all of the changes basically will be based on the fact that prices are changing. However, because prices are changing, there's an underlying change in the structure of the economy and what people consume. So as prices tend to go down over time, people will want to produce more of it, right? And as prices or consume more of it, as prices go up, then households will tend to consume less of it in terms of substitution. So these are the kinds of changes in the economy that's not being captured if you're keeping the base year constant. All right. So while it says here optional, the concept of chain-weighted GDP is very important. So currently we are under a fixed price base year, as we said. That's how you calculate real GDP. So what's nice about a fixed price real GDP, it's additive. The growth of RGDP and its contributions are easily computed. So the problem, however, is that, as I've mentioned before, under a fixed price real GDP measure, changes in relative prices will lead you to a wrong appreciation of the structure of the economy. So old prices are being used to value current output. So that means you're not capturing the relative importance of different industries over time. So a typical example why that would be wrong is a fast-growing sector and its relative prices are falling. Using the old prices will overstate the fast-growing sector's size because you're using the old higher price and you're multiplying it by the size or the output of the sector. So the old prices will overstate this fast-growing sector's size. So these are some of the reasons why rebasing is done to get a more accurate view of the size of the different sectors and how much they're growing. So rebasing will change the level of GDP, and it may change the growth rate if prices used are not proportional to each other, right? So there are some issues with rebasing. In response to these changes or these difficulties with fixed price and the need to rebase it every so often, a concept called the chain-weighted real GDP was created. Okay. And the benefits of the chain-weighted real GDP, it accounts for changes in relative prices and structure of the economy. The growth rate is the same regardless of the base year. The problem is it's not additive, but there is a decomposition of formula. So notice that you may be wondering why is this a benefit, right? Because rebasing could change the growth rate in the past. So by rebasing, you would have to revisit all of the growth rates in the past because it may change the relative level of it will change not just the level of GDP, but the growth rate of the GDP over time if the prices that are used are not proportional to each other, right? The new prices, the ones that are used to change the old base prices, are not proportional to each other. So rebasing can have these different changes over as when you're doing it. Okay? So it could lead to differences in the appreciation of the growth rate. However, in practice, it could change the growth rate of GDP, but in practice, you will find, for instance, that the growth rate doesn't really change that much, but it might change definitely if you do this rebasing. So what is the secret to chain weight? So the secret to chain weight is that here, I'm just going to add this line here. It's using the year before and the year after, okay, as the prices, the value output. And therefore, it's not tied to a distant a long ago base price. It's always good to calculate real GDP. So it's always going to use the year before and the year after, or the current year, to value output and calculate real GDP growth. So all of the flaws of the fixed price, wherein the changes in the relative prices over time, these are accounted for under the chain weight real GDP. Now there was an attempt to use chain weighted GDP to measure real GDP growth, and I think they're probably trying to calculate this in tandem or in parallel. But ultimately, the PSA decided here to simply rebase it and not to move to the chain-weighted real GDP and to calculate real GDP growth. This is in contrast to other countries, for instance, which offer both this fixed price and a chain-weighted real GDP growth as both measures, and they're both calculating it simultaneously, or in parallel, I should say, not simultaneously, in parallel. Such as, say, the United States, they would offer that. But the Philippines, we are definitely hanging on or continuing to use the fixed base price real GDP measure here. And we'll just rebase it every so often, again, to adjust for these changes in the economy, changes in consumer behavior and changes in user needs. All right, so that ends our discussion on real GDP and chain weight. All right. And second to the last topic on GDP is something called a decomposition. So whenever you have a fixed price real GDP, right, you are able to use this decomposition method, wherein a decomposition means you're able to decompose the growth in real GDP into its parts. Right? So here's the mathematical implementation of that. So if you were to do a derivative, you would get dy over y, dA over a over y. Notice that the a's in the denominator and the numerator, they cancel out. And same as the b's here, right? And here you're considering, for example, y is the sum of a and b. And the analogy we're going towards here is that GDP is the sum of C, I, G, and NX. So it's the same concept. But here, to simplify the exposition, we're just gonna say that, say your Y is composed of two things as opposed to four things. And then you get the derivative, and then you get these items here and here. And notice again, this is what what I mentioned earlier is the A's here actually go away, right? And why do you have a y in the denominator? You divided both sides by y. So that's why the dy here on the left, you divided by y, and each term will be divided by y here. So if the variable y is a sum of several other variables, you can decompose decompose the growth in y into the growth of each component weighted by their shares, right? So you can see that right now here in derivative form. So dy over y, the interpretation of that is the growth in y, and that's going to be equal to the growth in a times the share of a and y, a over y is the share, plus the growth in b, db over b, times the share of b and y. This is the discrete version of the above. This is the same as the above, but this time in terms of like years. So here is you have yt minus ys over ys is equal to, so this is the change or growth in GDP or some variable like inflation, for instance. Doesn't have to be GDP, could be inflation. It's equal to the growth in the particular element, which is A, right? There are two elements here, A and B. A, the growth in A, times the share of A and Y, plus the growth in B times the share of B and Y. So you can get the contribution of each element of growth in Y, the growth of A and B. And the growth of A and B is contributing to the growth in GDP depending on how large their share is here. So you can use the same decomposition for inflation. So we'll probably do that when we meet each other face to face. Okay. But for now, let's look at the GDP. An example of this in GDP. Okay. Here. So this is just GDP that I have downloaded from the Philippine Statistics Authority. And here are the 2000 prices here, valued in 2018 prices. So this is constant or real GDP. Okay. So this is real GDP in constant 2018 prices. So notice what we've got here. You've got household consumption, that's your C. This is your G. This is your I, or capital formation. This is exports and then imports. And then here I simply added net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports. So you'll notice that it's negative because we're importing more than we're exporting. Then you get the shares. So if you look at the formula, it's B15, which is this one divided by your gross domestic product, which is 77%. And then you take up the shares for each item. And you'll notice that net exports is negative, and therefore its share, quote unquote, is negative. And then you calculate the growth per component. So household expenditure right, grew this much. So the 21 household expenditure minus 2,000 divided by 2,000, and that's what gives you these numbers. So household consumption grew by 3.94%. Government final consumption shrank by 1.32. Gross capital formation grew by 20%. Net exports grew by 65%. Okay. And then you calculate the weighted growth. And the weighted growth is simply just this one, right? This one, which is the growth times the weights. That's the weighted growth. So 3.92 times the share. 3.94, I should say, times the share of 77%. And you'll get 3.0%. And you take that for each of the components. So this is household, this is government final, this is investment, and this is net exports. So I invite you to download all of this data. This is not special, the year 2000. You can do it for any year. And then you'll find that when you add them up, the number will be 3.05. See, if you see, you can download this. This is the sum of all of these ones. And the sum is 3.05. Now you can check that this is in fact equal to the growth of real GDP. And you have that here. This is just simply the growth of real GDP. 719 blah blah minus 689 divided by 689. That is also 3.05. So the weighted growth approach will lead to the same growth rate as simply by getting the growth rate directly, which is this number minus this number divided by this number. And you'll see that of the 3%, what's dragging it down, for instance, is your net exports here. Meaning we could have had 6% if our net exports had been 0. That's essentially it. So it's going down. Our growth rate went down by 3.14% because of our negative net exports. Two positive and very important drivers are household consumption and investment, right? They both contributed to that. So essentially what's happening here is they both made us 16, right? Made us 6, I should say. And then it subtracted from net exports by 3. So 6 minus 3 is 3. Whereas final government expenditure shrank, but nominally. It's almost 0%, really. So that's how you might want to, think about, think about the contribution of each of these items to the growth of that variable, right? So you can also imagine, so that's what you've done. You've calculated this and this for the different components for consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Then you multiply them by their shares. And we've discovered that the sum of all of this, in fact, has to be equal to the plain Jane growth in GDP here. So GDP this year minus GDP last year divided by GDP last year. Now we'll do the same decomposition for inflation. We'll probably have more of this in the future, but I wanted to show you the same concept can be done for inflation. Okay. So here you've got your CPI weights. So these are your weights in the basket. But maybe we should pause this discussion on inflation in a moment. So we'll pause this first and go to the decomposition of inflation after we talk about inflation. At this point, however, we'll realize that this change in Y, if Y were CPI or a measure of prices, then the growth in prices would be inflation. Then you can also decompose your inflation rate into the different components here. All right, our final topic for real GDP, and then we'll pause and then we'll do a part 2, will be the discussion on the informal sector. So we've seen above that the informal sector is incorporated into the calculation of GDP through the unorganized industry. There have been surveys conducted to study the informal sector called the Informal Sector Survey in 2008 and in 2018. I think I just told this. Now, in this part, I wanted to share with you different calculations of the size of the informal sector. So if you look at Bersales and Ilarina, and I invite you to download their paper, it's on UVLE. 32.6% of our economy in 2018 is from the unorganized sector, based on the calculations for the unorganized sector that we just talked about. So if you look at the discussion on GVA of unorganized, etc., etc., when you do that, you can do that per year, and then you'll find that in 2018, their latest, and in fact, even for the current GDP for 2024, although they don't release publicly what the unorganized share is all the time. What they found is that if you do that, if you take the share of unorganized to total real GDP, it's 32.6%. There are other ways. So the whole point of Bersales and Arena is to show different ways in which you can calculate for estimate the informal sector. The second way is through the list of establishments. Okay, so the list of establishments is an important list where they have a long list of the different establishments that they can use for the labor force survey, to use for the ASPPI, etc. So there's this long list, and based on these definitions, LO, EO with total employment less than 10, so the definition for informal is single proprietorship, single establishment, total employment less than 10. If you were to use this list of establishments, which is updated every so often, and apply these filters, you will find that 68.7% of establishment will fill that definition. And this is another estimation of the size of informal economy. So this just says that of the total list of establishments, again, this is not about how much they produce or how about GDP, right? This is just, again, just counting the number of establishments. 68.7% of establishments are informal based on this, again, in 2018. I should write that down, 2018. In April 18's LFS, so here's a third way. Additional rider questions were added to define informal employment. Again, this is from Bersales and Ilarina. The key here is that they defined what's called informal sector enterprises. Okay. So this is different from the unorganized sector or even this LFS definition up here. So what is this? An informal sector enterprise are unincorporated private enterprises that are not constituted as separate legal entities independently of their owners. Okay, meaning they're pretty much their owners. And for which no complete accounts are available. So this is one important concept or facet of the unorganized or informal economy, is that there are no accounts, formal accounts that are available. And they would permit a financial separation of the production activities of the enterprise from the other activities of its owners. So the idea here is that if you're a household business, it's almost impossible to separate, your activities as a business and your activities as a person or as a household. So these are the kinds of enterprises that they wanted to capture in this round of the LFS using rider questions. So a rider question is extra questions that they added to a particular LFS. Private unincorporated enterprise include unincorporated enterprise owned and operated by individual household members or by several members of the same household, as well as unincorporated partnerships and cooperatives formed by members of different households. So it could be groups of different households working together. If they lack a complete set of accounts. And accounts are accounts for the business itself, like how much you're buying, how much you're selling, and so on. For the LFS, the following questions were added for the members. What is the legal status of the enterprise you own or where you work? How does your enterprise maintain its records? Right? Are you able to do it separately than yourselves, for example? Um, right? You have separate accounts for your businesses, yes or no? Does your enterprise where you own, where you work or uh, sell, barter its goods or services, yes or no? The result indicated that for the LFS round, 62.8 of employed people. So again, because of the fact that it could be individuals or groups of individuals, we're not sure, but definitely six. This is so we cannot talk about it in the same way as 68% of establishments, but you can see 62.8% of employed persons 15 years or over are part of the informal sector according to these rider definition questions. By gender, 66 are males and 56% are females in the informal sector. And I just wanted to point out the similarity of 62 and 68. The numbers are similar, but the values should be different. This will be the number of establishments based on the list of establishments. These are the percent or share of persons. And while we recognize that for most of these persons, these are probably single individual household members who run their own business but have no separate accounts for their own businesses. So you can imagine like small people who sell in sari-sari stores, people sell door to door, small cooperatives, like a grouping of small families, for example, producing peanut butter or bagoong or something. These are the kinds of businesses that you're imagining these people to belong to, and 62.8% of employed persons have indicated that they are informal based on these definitions here of the informal sector enterprise. All right, so very clearly, that's why it's very important to capture the informal sector, right? Because of the sheer number of employees, the sheer number of establishments, and the fact that they are able to produce 32.6% of real GDP in our economy. All right, so we'll pause here and we'll start again we'll finish the rest of this document doing inflation first, then unemployment. All right, see.